Welcome to the third episode of my Wicket Screencast. Today's topic is repeating stuff. We will display lists of data using RepeatingView, ListView and DataView, and I will also show you how to do pagination. My name is David. You can find out all about me on my blog davidtanzer.net, or you can follow me on Twitter. My name there is dtanzer.
I have changed the application a little bit since the last episode. For example, I have created an empty class called ListNewsletters and added all the imports we need, so you don't have to watch me type import statements, which is rather boring. This HTML file was already part of the project skeleton. It is a mockup of the newsletters list. But you can see this mockup does not only contain the newsletters list, but also some text that should show when there are no newsletters available, the so-called blank slate. This is here because an empty list does not look good. You should always display some blank slate that is not an empty list when you don't have any data to display. At the moment, both the blank slate and the actual content will show at the same time, but I want to change that now. The blank slate should only display when there are no newsletters, so we need the newsletter repository, and from the repository we need the size, which is the number of newsletters available. The blank slate and the content will be web markup containers. A web markup container is a Wicket component that does nothing. It is just a representation of some HTML in the page class, but it has no real functionality. It can be visible or active or inactive, but that's basically it. I have already added the web markup container for the blank slate, which only shows when the size is 0. And now I add another web markup container for the content, which only shows when the size is non-zero. Now I can compile and run the application, and after Gradle has started the web server, we should see that only the blank slate shows and the list has disappeared. The blank slate contained a link to the Create Newsletter form, and this link in the mockup directly references createnewsletter.html, so it doesn't work yet because it should not link to the static page but to the Wicket page, to admin add, the page we created in the last episode. For this we simply use Wicket link and add the correct path. And now Wicket knows how to create this link so that it references the Wicket page. When I restart the server, I can click the link to create a new newsletter, and after I have created the new newsletter, the blank slate will disappear and the list of newsletters will show. This list of newsletters will, of course, still be empty or still be the static mockup because we have not created any code to show the list yet. But before I'll populate the data, I will start with a simpler example. I will create an unordered list which should contain all the names of all known newsletters. And to create this list, I used the Wicket component RepeatingView. A RepeatingView lets you add an arbitrary number of other components, so we'll add a new label for every newsletter we know. I get the list of newsletters from the repository, and to get this list I need to specify two parameters. The number of the first newsletter we want to get, and the number of newsletters. So we just want to get the first 100 newsletters in this case. Don't worry about the literal numbers, I will refactor this later anyway. I iterate over all these newsletters with a for each loop, and for every newsletter entity I add a new label that shows the name of the newsletter. I don't use a literal ID here, I use new child ID, a method from the RepeatingView, to get an ID that represents the next child of the RepeatingView. And now the page shows an unordered list with one entry, and this entry shows the name of the newsletter we created earlier. There is a better way to display lists of stuff in Wicket, the ListView. The ListView takes a Java util list, iterates over it, and calls a method for every item. So I create the ListView object, and I create an anonymous inner class, and I have to override the method populateItem. The ListView will create a listItem object for every item in the newsletters list, and call populateItem with this listItem object. What I do now in populateItem is I get the newsletter entity from the listItem, and I add a label to the listItem. The label contains the name of the newsletter. For this label, now I need an ID. I use the ID name. I don't have a method new child ID anymore, because the list allows us to specify more flexibly how the list will look like. In the HTML code, I now need a tag with the same Wicket ID, so I simply create a span within the listItem tag. When I reload the page now, you won't notice any difference at first, because we show almost the same HTML code. We have just changed the implementation in the Java code. But when I inspect the page, you can see that the listItem tag contains a span tag, so we really show the ListView now and not the RepeatingView anymore. But there's still a problem with this code. We don't really have a list. We want to show the content of the repository, and we only got a list because we received the first 100 items from the repository. So what we really want to do is display some arbitrary data, and this arbitrary data is the whole content of our repository. To do this, we create the DataView, and the DataView does not display the content of a list. It gets its data to display from a data provider. So I have to create a class newsletter data provider, and this class has to implement the interface iDataProvider. This interface specifies 4 methods: detach, size, iterator, and model. We don't need detach right now. The size method should return the number of items that can be displayed, and the iterator should return an iterator for a range of items. The range is specified by the index of the first items and a maximum number of items. And the last method we have to implement is the model method, which creates an iModel for a given object. In this case, we only return a very simple model that is an object of the class model. Now I have a compiler error, and I should have used implements instead of extends when implementing an interface. Notice that I didn't change the populate item method from the ListView to the DataView. I just changed the type of the argument from list item to item, but everything else can stay the same. And again, when I run the application now, we should not see much change because we create the same HTML as before. Now this list works pretty well, but we don't really want to display an unordered list. We want to display the table that we got mocked up from the designer. We can just change the design of our data view without changing any Java code at all. We simply reassign the Wicket IDs and that's it. There's one little change I want to add. I want to display the date when a newsletter was created, so I just add a new label for the date. But for the existing data view, I don't have to change any Java code, and I will completely have changed the design when I'm done with this. I add another table header for the created date, but that's it. Now when we reload the application, we will see that the unordered list is gone and that the newsletter name and the created date show in the table. Now I'll add some more newsletters so you can see how a longer list looks like. Let's reload the list and then it shows 8 newsletters. This list could become arbitrarily long, so I want to add pagination here. To do this, we'll need another placeholder in the HTML, a div with a Wicket ID where we can show a paging navigator component. The paging navigator component is a Wicket component that adds pagination to any other component that implements a certain interface, iPageable. The data view does this. So we want the data view to display only 5 items at a time. I'll add that as another constructor parameter. And I add a paging navigator component to the page. This paging navigator knows the list, and that's it. We'll have paging functionality now. I restart the server, and then after I reload the page, you'll see that there is a pager. The list only displays 5 items at a time, and the pager can be used to change pages. It doesn't look very pretty, but you can change this with some simple CSS rules.
Now you should know how to display repeating data using DataView, ListView and RepeatingView. In the next episode we will refactor the application. I will show you how to move certain aspects out of the page classes to achieve a better separation of concern. If you have any further questions, please contact me. My email address is business@davidtanzer.net and my name is David.